Well, welcome back to SideQuest VIII, SideQuest 8 in honor of Final Fantasy VIII. This is our second episode, and back with me is Mr. Wesley Shantz. Wes, great to see you again today.
Yeah, good to see you. Good morning.
A bit talking about this time, and just to frame things for our listeners, I doubt many people are listening along the way, but those who have found this channel and your channel, and hopefully people do find these archives and these wonderful digital archives, and they're still around for, I don't know, ever or millennia or generations beyond here. Hopefully they have the sort of experience that I once had with many online lecturers from the great courses and YouTube and such, where I started listening to these sorts of people, and I just realized, wow, everything they talk about, there is something insightful worth gleaning, even when they talk about things that are not naturally interesting to me, or not the things that I was originally attracted to that these people discussed. And so I hope that our listeners are very into Final Fantasy Squaresoft, the relationship between culture, mythology, literature, and video games, particularly Golden Age 1990s video games. But I also hope that they find value in getting to spend some time with us, which apparently not everybody else in the world does, because we're talking to each other and not everybody else at this moment. But we're creating this space for people, and hopefully that has some value. But so today we were going to talk a little bit about, we were supposed to talk about the introductory cinematic last time, and the introduction to Squall and Cypher, and their initial training exercise and their mutual scars that they gave to each other, marking each other. Interesting work by Dennis Slattery called The Wounded Body, I believe, a Pacifica instructor. I know that recently you sent out a long form sort of update on your work where you were citing two Pacifica students' dissertations. But he talks about the ways in which famous characters are identified by their wounds. Odysseus with his scar, for example, or more relevant perhaps to newer listeners, Albus Dumbledore with his scar on his leg on his knee that is a map of the London Underground, and various things like that. But for this particular time, we got through a freak's cave, learned how to junction guardian forces, learned about this strange junctioning system. There are apparently multiple gardens. Went through this seed exam, practicum exam, where one entered a battle, had to follow orders. And in fact, my character was not the captain of his group. He had to follow orders, which seems to have helped him out, because the captain didn't pass the exam because of the choices he made. And so that always made me feel a little bit dishonest, because I really wanted to follow the captain's orders. He fails the test and I passed it. And then at the end of the exam, I made it to seed rank 4, not particularly high, I don't think, because I think I made a lot of mistakes playing through this time. And then met the titular interest of Renoa, and saw the cinematic, while also meeting or getting to hang out with Quistis Treppi, Instructor Treppi, and she enigmatically suggested that she was only going to give a last order, and I, Squall, Leonhardt, now have to meet her in the training area where apparently students go to talk after hours. And so seems to be some tension, romantic of sorts, bubbling up between her and me, insofar as I am Squall Leonhardt. Also, just a personal note, my wife came up yesterday and watched me play for 5 seconds, got to see the ball scene, and even funny, the character before him, who you don't even know, he says, do your best, even though you don't stand out. She, my wife saw Squall change his dress from his formal garb into what he usually wears, with his cut-off leather, jerking his 3 belts, and she couldn't stop laughing at him. Which that may be something laughable about Squall. But okay, so that was basically the fence around which we were going to put the pasture, around which we were going to, the fence we put around the pasture, which was the discussion for today, or so. Though many sheep may escape. But yes, Wes, so what's been on your mind? How have you enjoyed this time through? Are you playing it through yet? Are you watching the videos? And depending on your answer to that, should we discuss it?
Well, yeah, we can talk about things that I've played and things that I played 10 or 15 years ago or whenever it was that I last played this game. I've only just made it through the fire cavern and come back out because I've spent a lot of time drawing magic from random encounters. And it just, I can sit and play for about a half hour to an hour at a time. And that's about enough time to like max out one magic spell or something like that, right? It's like a bit of a bit of a slow start to this game. When I think about, comparing it with Seven, the way that game opens with a sort of a sequence that you watch, but then very quickly you're into the first mission of the game. You're going along with this character that you don't really have any background for yet. It's very in medias res kind of deal. And while this game sets up that way with its opening sequence, which is like a battle, and then there's all these kind of dreamlike images happening. You wake up in the infirmary, you kind of walk around the school for a bit. There's not a lot of attention right away to, you kind of get to take it slow at the start. And so I explored the garden a bit. I haven't played any card games yet, but I'm looking forward to playing some cards, with some people. And like I said, a little bit of grinding FF8 style, which is not beating a lot of enemies, but spending a lot of time in battles, just drawing and stocking up on magic spells. So
You know,
that's where I'm at.
I think that's totally fair and true because something about Final Fantasy VII, and I want to compare this game a lot to Final Fantasy VII, in particular the art, the music, the character design. I think, especially because they came out a year, I think 1 year, maybe a year and a half apart from each other, and I played them at the same time when I was first 14.
Right.
I was sensitive to a lot of the similarities between them, but a major difference I would say is that you're totally right that Final Fantasy VII throws you into the middle of a mission with this very heart pumping music, and you just gotta go, and you don't really need to know how to fight yet. You just press attack and use some potions and
Yeah.
sophisticated into the nuances of the game. Whereas Final Fantasy VIII in some ways starts a little bit more like a traditional RPG, though one is at a sort of super mercenary school that doesn't seem to be entirely good, right? Like in the very first mission, one's team is called away from a communications tower that where one could actually defend the spot because the Dalit and is in the city of Dalit that's been invaded by these Galbadian forces. We don't know anything additional about them yet. We could have defended the communications tower from the Galbadians, but we were called to retreat because they didn't pay us to do that. And so the moral ambiguity to this sort of mercenary group. Connection, though, is to Cloud Strife being a mercenary and Squall being a mercenary, and perhaps a deeper connection being that are either of them truly mercenaries? When we look at the larger goal of Seeds, which Headmaster Sid wanted to tell us a little bit about at our graduation, at our upranking, but this garden faculty member who doesn't look like different from Quistis, or she just dresses differently from them, sort of like how Cypher dresses differently from the other seed candidates. But Headmaster Sid is interrupted, and so we don't get to hear whether there is a greater further mission to Garden. But we start in our home, right? And it's called a garden. It's like starting in Chrono Cross or Legend of Legaia or Legend of Zelda, the first one on the N64. I'm forgetting its name, Ocarina of Time, of course, where one starts in one's sort of home. And one has to do basic tasks like go to the classroom and maybe read on the tutorial. And one branches out from there. One thing I want to say that's very powerful about this is that after one goes through one's first mission, where Squall for the very first time sees live combat, and one has a cinematic where he's first seen live combat with very heart-pumping music by Nobuo Uematsu, which really gets me going. There's this beautiful cinematic of Garden when one comes back in just for like a 2-second cinematic. And one walks in and one sees it and the music starts up again. And I really thought it almost made me want to like sort of cry in nostalgia that it's like this is the feeling of coming home after experiencing something outside, after experiencing violence and 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 war, conflict for the first time. And it made it seem all the more special coming home. And that's not something that Cloud necessarily gets. That's not necessarily something that he gets the entire Final Fantasy VII or even through Advent Children. The idea of home there is a little bit interesting, but but for all of its sort of uh, fantasy and mechanical sci-fi hijinks, there is a traditionalism to Final Fantasy VIII that I think is missing in Seven, and I do think that the hook of it comes in the first mission. The first mission is really engaging and was what first caught me, got me enjoying the game. Whereas being someone who has played the game before, I experienced the first hour or so just like you, where I knew that because of the lore underlying magic and guardian forces, the summons in Final Fantasy VIII, that there's an interesting draw system you compared it to throwing Pokeballs and catching Pokemon,
Right.
and that one can only draw and use magic when one has a guardian force junction to one, and there's apparently some moral qualms about using guardian forces in differing areas of the world and at different gardens too. This seems to be something unique that those at Balem Garden do. And so knowing what I know that one can break the game or really make the game easier for oneself if one draws the right things, has one's GF level up in such ways as to be able to junction stat modifications to oneself in such a way as to make oneself powerful, that this can really change one's playthrough as one goes through the game, but that this slows down the initial part of the game. But it will perhaps like a well-planned life make it so that we have multiple avenues or multiple ways through which we can play the game. There will be more freedom. If say, you want to have a really strong squall who can just slice things up, or really powerful GFs that can blow everybody away, or good defensive magic, or get like Squall's highest level sword on the first disc. There are 4 discs in this game.
Right.
So I totally agree that this game starts super slowly, but it's because of the sort of nascent freedom that this game is offering to one. It's almost like the job system that one sees in Final Fantasy X and in earlier iterations,
Mhm.
but not. And it does require, I think, a little bit of a desire to use a strategy from the get-go that one is going to see flower throughout the game, but that does not have the same in medias res grasping potential as Final Fantasy VII, which is why you have to play Final Fantasy VII while playing Final Fantasy VIII. So the boring moments and the more interesting moments, I think, coalesce together so that you have.
That'd be funny. Yeah, it'd be cool. I mean, I think it makes sense that those would fit together in a fun way, uh, because they come out very close together. They are, in some ways, riffing on a lot of the same ideas. Um, but then something about the accentuation of certain elements from 7 to 8 is where you I think you start to see a little bit more clearly an artistic intention. All right. And in terms of gameplay experiences, yeah, I think they are messing with your expectations, because if you go in thinking that the way to play this genre of game is to beat up a lot of monsters, gain experience, get stronger, uh, it turns out that that's not actually a very good strategy at all. You do have to understand the systems that are at work here, which have much more to do with getting into the nitty gritty of drawing magic, junctioning spells, and paying attention to what skills your GF is learning. Um, Paying attention to time as well, right? Both the missions, the initial missions, have to do with like setting a time goal for yourself, right? And all the other ways in which your rank is determined, which is not extremely obvious within the game,
Oh,
where it helps to have a little bit of help from outside the game, right? If you are in fact going for some kind of perfect run or completionism, or just trying to be efficient, which is a consideration for some of us. Speaking for myself, I have peeked at the guide and online tips and tricks and stuff to be like, all right, I don't have that much time to play this. I do want to try to play it, so let me try to make this time uh, effective, efficient, and try to, if at all possible, try to avoid having to restart again, because that loss of time gameplay is that's a killer. That's a killer. But I know with your version of it, you've got some quality of life improvements, so that must be nice.
Well, so it's interesting time, because obviously time will be the major theme of this,
Hmm.
and amnesia will be, and sort of a Platonic theory of recollection of some sort, and maybe of eternal return from Nietzsche will be at play with this notion of time compression that we'll run into at some point. It's interesting that you noted us being put on the clock, and we were put on the clock early on, and I think the first reactor in Final Fantasy VII too, which again
That's true.
adds to the sort of
Yeah.
intensity of it. But something interesting about this game that I think Chrono Trigger, also your favorite game, Earthbound, and to some extent Chrono Cross with the different color magics and the
Hmm.
field dynamic in the battles, are playing Final Fantasy VIII, and that, like what you said, if you try and go through this game sort of just quickly without understanding the nuances of the battle system, the junction system, the magic system, which very quickly you're made to do, because you have to figure out, because without doing a basic level of work and investigating into that, you are left without the tools necessary to progress very far. You only have an attack option, right? You have to
Right.
actually go into your menu and learn how to junction a GF so that you can learn how to put a draw command in fight, a magic command,
Hmm.
a GF command, and even an item command to use items in battle. Otherwise, you're just going to be press and fight constantly, and that won't lead very far. Also, an interesting dynamic of Final Fantasy VIII is that the monsters and bosses level up with you.
Right.
So if you just level up, you will in fact scale up the monster's strength to such a degree where the game gets increasingly difficult, so difficult to where, like, if you don't know how to upgrade your items, and if you don't know how to junction, and you haven't spent a bunch of time sort of grinding, or at least understanding how to use your time most intelligently, you can get to a point in the game where it's going to be almost impossible to progress, where every random battle encounter can be death defying, can lead to death. And so there's something really, I don't want to say sinister, but nuanced about time and the use of time in this work. And to what you said about things not being obvious. So during seed testing, if say one interacts with other characters, the more people that one talks to, and this is something I simply recall from many years ago, that decreases one's seed rating, as if one is dawdling with one's time, which
Yeah.
is antithetical to the general RPG experience,
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
When you're outside of the test, you find out that Zeldinkt, who's part of your party when you go on the first fight, the Tifa, the fighting master,
Hmm.
the monk, I guess, in this game, is Garden, and this is perhaps part of why he's looked down upon. This sort of notion that he is a local, that he's a townie, as it were, making itself into this virtual world. But if you spend your time talking to these individuals, you lose seed ranking, and so there's something that, like you said, like choices in real life, the consequences of the choices in this game are not immediately accessible. You see them when you get your evaluation after your first test. You get to see, after you finish the test, all the tallies off, all the markdowns that you've received. And so, right, to your question, something we texted about was the nuance and the ethics of playing a game like this. So we are not playing on our original consoles. We do not have the original four discs in hardware. I think you might have them, but you're playing on a different console. You do have a physical memory card. I don't. I'm now playing the remastered version, where now I can see the faces of the characters. And even when I was running away from the sort of mechanical scorpion thing, there was
Yeah.
at least one segment where everything was sped up. And I thought that might have been a quality of life improvement. So one has 30 minutes to complete the mission. And part of the scary part of this is that one has to fight this boss like 4 or 5 times while fleeing from it, and it continues to rejuvenate. So the time just ticks down. Again, very similar to the original Mako reactor, or the first Mako reactor in Final Fantasy VII. But while one is doing that, oh, I'm sorry, I'm forgetting the point I was. Oh yes, while I was doing that, there was one section, and I don't know if this was a glitch or whether this was actually written into the game, where the battle was sped up, like everybody had haste, but the time went at the normal speed, so it was not also sped up. And then there was also a section of running where I ran super fast, and I wondered if that was the game or the game developers looking back at this section, realizing it wasn't particularly fair or was too tightly, or the time was made too tight for enjoyment, and wanted to make it a little more like an easy mode and make it more possible for people, younger people, or people who are not quite as good at this game yet because it's perhaps their first time, or people who are just playing it for nostalgia purposes and were never good at it, making it so that this onerous, difficult part of the game that might be difficult to get through and might lead to someone putting down the controller and stopping the game might make it easier to get through. And so this made us wonder about, well, 2 aspects of the game that bring up ethical questions. One is one playing the original game in a remastered version that has quality of life adjustments? I don't know how many Final Fantasy VIII has besides aesthetic ones, like the faces being and non-cinematics being improved, though maybe this speed up feature is actually a feature and wasn't a bug of this moment. But it makes me wonder about whether later in the game there will be things like or experiences like one has in Final Fantasy XII, where there's this major boss, I'm forgetting the name of it, that I think can take many days to actually beat. He has something like 50 million HP in the game. But because of how the Zodiac Age remasters and changes certain features of the game, that boss can now be beaten in 24 hours. Much more reasonable, right? But as I've been playing through this game, I'm realizing that the fights and the mistakes and the annoying things that happened by accident, like Zell got knocked out of nowhere when I was fighting against the first boss, and I don't have any characters that have an item setting yet, and so I couldn't use a Phoenix down to revive him, and that was really aggravating me, even though I'm playing the simulated game. And it made me think that, well, games in their original forms, for all of their flaws, the flaws are part of the original game and the original emotions. And generally, I think younger gamers from our generation were willing to put up with the flaws of games when the game was good enough in order to get to the next stage. Like, one would know there was this terrible mini game that was almost impossible to get through, or this really difficult boss out of nowhere that was inconsistent with the game at large. But in some ways that functioned as sort of like a life lesson for us. We're like, well, if we want the bigger pie, if we want, which we do because our friends are playing these games and they're also defeating these enemies and bosses and getting past these difficult tasks, that we just have to grit our teeth and be able to get through this annoying mini game or this difficult boss. But in a remastered version that irons out some of these details that were features of the original game, one is denied that feeling and that judgment of, is going through this extremely annoying part actually worth it? Can I, how many times do I have to go through this ski game in Final Fantasy VII right after Aerith has died? It just doesn't seem super appropriate. I'm sick of it, I think oftentimes in Final Fantasies, they make the most annoying bosses optional bosses, like, will I ever beat Emerald Weapon or Ruby Weapon? But I think in smoothing out the game a little bit, there is a change to the experience, the phenomenology of playing the game, which also leads to a different evaluation of what the value of the game is. Because I think, and I'm going to overstate it a little bit, to some extent, having to go through a tough patch in a game in order to get to the better parts is good practice for being in relationships with adult things as an adult, one's career, relationships with people that go through rough patches, that that sometimes one realizes that when one goes through a very annoying moment that maybe takes too long, whether again, whether it be in one's job or with the people one loves, one's wife, one's husband, one's best friends, one has to sort of take a second and be like, this is not my favorite part of being with this person or being in this profession, but do I want to grit my teeth and go through this in order to get to the good that I know is on the other side? Now, that I think might be an overstatement, but that is sort of I think the basis of judgments like those in one's adult life does exist in these older games that do have clear flaws, or at least clear I'm forgetting the term, focal points that draw one's attention into a moment and take away from the entire tapestry of the game. I know I said too much on that to make a second point, but I'll just quickly append on like bad student writing the second point, which is the ethics of using a strategy guide. Mm-hmm. Now, obviously, these games, like you said, there are lots of secrets within them that one would not be able to naturally intuit. Even taking all of the hints from the games themselves, there's certain hidden bosses, certain hidden areas, certain hidden ways of doing things that, like, one has to do something like, I don't know, dodge like in Final Fantasy X, dodging a lightning bolt 100 times.
Yeah, right.
Almost impossible to do in that particular desert area. But how does one even know that that is the number that one is aiming towards without a strategy guide? And so my second question is it unethical to use a strategy guide the first time through? Is it ethical to use a strategy guide if one is attempting to play the game differently, not just to beat the game, but to complete the game? Or am I looking at this incorrectly, that a strategy guide might be, say, a crutch for a weaker player, but it might be something that helps to bring out the true value and the true experience of a game by highlighting the fact that there's more to it than one sees, for a more advanced or even a neophyte player? Does a strategy guide take away from one's experience of discovery and of fighting through the game and achieving, for oneself, or does it bring out the flavor of the game like salt, and show just how much more, or show someone how much more nuanced and how much more sophisticated this work of art is than immediately meets one's eyes without knowing how much more there is from the guide? Sorry.
I think, to that point, when these games came out and people were first discovering things about them, there was definitely a certain excitement that went along with finding something for the first time, right? And I think that excitement is still there, latent in the game, for anyone who's playing it for the first time now, doesn't know what they're looking for in advance, and or someone who's forgotten, right? And you rediscover. And so there's that. I think that's the great, joy of playing the game without any, extra knowledge or, outside help or anything like that. And I think there's a trade-off where you can sacrifice that in order to make sure that you have a more complete experience of all the things that there are to find. Now, arguably, you're not finding them for yourself at that point. You're just sort of checking boxes, right? You're saying, okay, there's a thing that I'm going after. Let me make sure I get that. All right, I did that. Now on to the next thing, right? And so it distinctly changes the quality of the experience. I don't know that one is, per se better than the other. It might depend on the player. It might depend on what their goals are and so forth. It's certainly the case that the game accommodates both styles of play, and the game, in very important respects, won't be changed depending on which style of play you engage in. The game is going to have the same story beats as far as the main quest goes, right? You're still going to have to do certain threshold things to proceed with the rest of the story, right? And so there's kind of uh, I guess a base level of effort is going to go in either way, right? And a certain amount of time, aside from mods or exploiting glitches and things within the game itself, right? And
Yeah,
so
what do
so
you know
there's
about
that.
those? Yeah, so like Game Shark,
Hmm.
mods, playing on PC, which PC gamers swear by playing on PCs, even with
Hmm.
Fantasy, the most recent iteration of the remake, Rebirth. PC
Hmm.
gamers are loving it, and they have additional features like they can move the camera autonomously during CGI sequences,
Uh,
yeah, which is mind-boggling. That's
yeah.
amazing. Like you're actually there. But yeah, so okay, so the strategy guide. You put it, I think, very pragmatically. Maybe it depends on the sort of player. And for me personally, I that does resonate with me because if I am just reading the strategy guide before I go into any particular place,
Hmm.
there's so much that one can do, and there are so many shoulds, and make sure that you do this, and you don't want to miss this. That, like you said, it can become like a chore to go through
Hmm.
an area. Okay, I need to make sure to draw this GF from this boss, and I need to make sure that I get this secret thing because it will disappear after this, and I
Hmm.
need to get this dialogue with this one person, and it's like I want these things, but I also want the experience of playing a game and
Yeah.
not doing my chores. And so for me, yesterday, so something great about Final Fantasy VIII is that I knew it, I claim at this point, so well that I still have glimmers of memory of important things like draw from bosses.
Hmm.
And this first boss that I went against, I drew a GF from him, Siren. So make sure you don't miss Siren.
Right.
Um, but but right there was this sort of platonic recollection, and but I was also experiencing, though not for the first time, I was discovering, rediscovering, rather than following the guidance. But that said, sometimes the guides can also give helpful mythology and help contextualize some of what's happening in the game if one is just sort of following, clicking through the dialogue boxes in order to get to the next thing that one is doing.
Hmm.
And so okay, for sure. But what about mods, or say like Game Shark? Um, and playing with I mean, literally they're called cheats, right?
Right.
Game Shark. So there are ways to break the game in order to be able to breaking the game in Final Fantasy VIII means like acquiring such weapons or levels of skill and magic that one can easily defeat the vast majority of enemies and bosses for the vast majority of the game, starting
Hmm.
pretty early if one plays really, really, really intelligently, which is almost like a gift of having played it well in the past and learned about the nuances of the system. But that's still not using glitches.
Right.
That's using the internal mechanisms of the game. That's also not
Hmm.
using mods or a Game Shark to say give oneself one's level one character the lion heart apex
Right.
weapon of Squalor, making him invincible, or something like. What is your take on, say, using a mod or a cheat like that on a character? And would it be different if you were going through the game the second or third time as opposed to the first time? Would there be
Yeah.
something wrong with it going through it the first time?
I I mean I think it introduces um, a kind of disconnect, a basic disconnect between the game and the story. If your character is essentially invincible, right, and yet has to go through certain story beats, nevertheless, uh, it's a little bit silly. Um, I think it's super convenient, right, because then you're not spending as much time fighting random enemies and maybe struggling with certain bosses or whatever it might be, right? So there's again a really pragmatic side of it to just say like, yeah, I think if that helps smooth your way, then go for it. And then arguably you could focus more on other aspects of the game because your attention is not solely on let me get through this tough battle or whatever. Um, I think the idea that a player would discover those things on their own is a little bit I mean, that stretches credibility. But somebody obviously figured it out, right? They kind of looked at it and said, huh. And so you can um, you can always adjust how you're playing to either um, have more of a uh, I guess like default experience, right? And what is kind of expected, or you can go the full other extreme and do things that are either hidden within the game so well that you'd only find them because you read about them somewhere, or things that are actually outside of the game as it's made, right? So cheats and things like that. Um, no, I don't know that there's a like an ethical problem there. Um, but perhaps there is something that you know at a certain point the experience it becomes something different. And and I think that for people who are studying the game in order to understand how it works technically, those kinds of mods are really interesting. I think they're probably an important factor. Like digging into the files of the game and seeing things that were unfinished but are still left in there or whatever, right? Stuff like that. On the other hand, for people, for my kind of approach to games, I don't have that kind of technical knowledge or particular interest even, um, and I'm more interested in things that are there on the story level, on the character level. I'm interested in the game insofar as it's the kind of atmosphere around that. It's the basic structure within which that story unfolds. But you know, I could I could get the super weapon and be totally fine with that. It wouldn't like make me feel really great about myself or anything like that. I just would like to be able to get through random encounters a little faster. But there's also things like built into the game where you can, I think, turn off random encounters pretty quickly here. We're going to get a GF that has an ability that will just like allow you to not fight random battles. So there's yeah, there's certain things about this game that once you know that they're there, make it a pretty unique experience in in terms of most JRPGs up to that time. Um, I I mean I think there's probably things in the remaster, like the thing that speeds it up and all that, um, that have really helped more people stick with the game and discover it. Uh, and I'm hoping that, you know, again, they don't, define themselves or think less of themselves for using some of those helps. Because I know people can get really tied up with their identity around the way that they play games and the way they talk about them and stuff. So
Well, that's interesting because I do think the experience of playing the remaster is different from the original, and that's why some of the elements in the remaster are put in there in order to make the experience smoother or better
mhm.
in certain instances. This is a good opportunity, I think, to think about an additional factor in when we're discussing experience of absorbing the art. So nowadays we in the 2020s we have YouTube and various online platforms where people will post for free and Twitch and Discord and such. They'll post their own playthroughs of the games, and so you can not only watch all of the CGIs in like an hour or two of many Final Fantasies and most RPGs in existence now,
Mhm.
if you're so inclined, but you can even watch people play through and while watching their reactions, while watching the reactions of their followers, or even joining in on those. I think you've actually done this a
Mhm.
couple times,
Yeah.
which I think is pretty cool. But because you are so strapped for time, and I remember being very strapped for time for Final Fantasy VII, and we talked a lot about this, and I learned a lot about my own personality and attempting to complete things while putting the minimum effort in. I think was something that I realized I was attempting to do in that game and perhaps my entire life at that moment. Hopefully I've moved past that. But
Yeah.
something I was thinking as I played this game was, again, my initial perspective was similar to yours. I'm very busy. I'm an athlete. I do a lot of races. I do some strongman competitions. I'm a doctoral candidate and a doctoral student in 2 different programs. I teach at the college level. I'm busy. I have a family, not as big as yours, but I have a lot going on. And now I am the sort of person that prefers to get my work done so that I can not have stress rather than to put off my work in order to play, which is how I used to use video games. I remember, in fact, when Kingdom Hearts first came out when I was a junior in high school, and I had an AP US history test the next day that I had not studied for. And I remember thinking the moment I bought the game, well, there's no way I'm going to study for this AP US history exam. Whereas nowadays, I'd probably be much quicker to study for an exam or just to study anything than I would be to engage in playing a video game. And so sometimes, and we talked about this with Final Fantasy VII, playing the video game itself, now that we're engaged in a study and doing a podcast on it and putting something in the archive for posterity, the gameplay itself can seem like a chore and work, like checking off a box, like if one uses a strategy guide and is trying to be a perfectionist or a completionist in going through the game. But because I was experiencing some boredom in the get-go of the game, when I got to the first mission with the music, with fighting, and I figured out a more balanced way of drawing instead of just I started drawing every battle and then finishing off enemies or finding just one sole weak enemy, like a single Galbadian soldier, and really drawing everything I could out of him. I started finding new ways of doing the sort of work of the game that allowed me to stay more engaged within the actual story and plot and fun of the game. And of course, I couldn't spend all my time doing that sort of thing once the timer kicked in and I had to run away from Dalit as well. So what I'm trying to say is that because I was playing the game and not just watching it, and I had to make these decisions myself, and I had to experience some of the boredom of the pre-game or the intro of the game, the prologue of the game, the first moments of the game, but then the huge excitement of getting into a seed training exam and with active combat, that I found myself engaged. I went from feeling like I was engaged in a chore, drawing, trying to set everything up, maybe like writing the scenario for a Dungeons and Dragons game, to actually playing the game. And it made me think of what Socrates says in the Phaedo by Plato, which he's first met in Phaedo, and his clasps, his manacles are taken off, and he rubs his arms and he says, it's the relief I'm feeling right now. I imagine I wouldn't have been able to feel such relief if I hadn't had pain on my wrists first. And this makes me think that something about the game is buying in with your time and with your energy and seeing value and seeing these things that seem like they don't have value, like making Gil in a virtual space when you are an adult who needs to make real money in the real world.
Right.
Seem like not that big a deal, right? But even in one's pleasurable activities and one's pleasurable pursuits, and this is something I now know from traveling quite a bit, every part of travel is not fun, particularly everything that has to do with planes these days. Not fun, pretty onerous. But I would still say I like to travel, though many parts of travel take a lot of work and are very stressful, and are not that fun. Like when I'm sitting in a middle seat in a Spirit Airlines, cabin, and for 4 straight hours in order to get to some place while starving, waiting for some terrible pretzels to come my way. And yet still, this is part of the larger good experience. I wonder if playing the game doesn't enable one to have a better pitch of pleasure, a higher pitch of pleasure, because one is literally more manually engaged, and more mentally engaged, making the choices, feeling the game with the controller. And this is something that's very important to me because I feel like when you see me move my thumbs, you know that I actually am a texter or a video game player, because they can only these thumbs can only move this way because of years and years thousands and thousands of hours being used to actually manipulate some character, or write some texts, write some AIMs back in the day. But because I'm not just watching the game, because I'm playing the game, I feel the subtle emotions of being annoyed at my own decisions, and when things go wrong, when there's like a roll of a dice that doesn't go my way. I do get to feel the sense of control of making my decisions, of having autonomy or agency over my own destiny to some extent. We'll really parse that out as we go through Final Fantasy VIII. Do we, to what extent do we have agency over our character's destiny in a game that is to some extent prescribed as not an open world game? And even our own lives, right? Perhaps they're more determined than we think they are, than we'd like to think they are. But I think that some of the more pleasant experiences of the game come from the fact that one has to go through the unpleasant experiences, like grinding or fighting some boss 5 times and losing, and then finally beating this boss. That only through doing this does one arouse the emotions that truly connect one to the game. And whereas if I were just like sort of watching the game, I might have the emotion of being annoyed at the choices that the individual playing the game makes. And I have done that because I have watched lots of people play games over time, because I didn't want to get addicted to the game myself. Was my old early 20s way of looking at things. I'll watch you play the game instead of playing it, because I'll get addicted. But again, while I was playing yesterday, I was thinking, I actually do feel a sense of satisfaction. I am happy to have earned my seed rank 4, even though it's not a particularly high one, and certainly not the highest one I ever earned. But that I don't know, it's almost like the difference between reading a story and playing a game. I think there's a difference of ontology between playing on multiple levels and watching, and that certain aspects of the experience of playing are only accessible through playing, rather than watching, and that perhaps part of the essence or the soul of the experience of playing a game, or of one of these games, is actually in the playing, though there is so much watching and voyeurism involved.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'd agree with that. And as far as like purposes go, you can read a book to enjoy the book, or you can read a book to like learn information, or you can read the book to appreciate the way the book is giving you that information, right? There's a lot of kind of layers to that, and usually it's some combination of those. I think that when it comes to like really digging in and trying to understand the game itself, for me that's not like an end in itself either. Whereas playing the game, maybe there isn't a point beyond that, right? It is just for that particular kind of experience of play. That's a kind of, autotailous. It's an end in itself, and that's fine. On the other hand, maybe it's to, reflect certain things, bring them into greater relief, whether it's things about oneself, or things about the themes and the story within the game, or some kind of combination there. Most likely, looking at the text from the game, watching someone else's playthrough, those are things that will kind of help and feed that reflective process, that contemplative kind of approach, right? It's not that it negates or does away with the experience of playing it. It's just, a different kind of purpose that the game can also afford. So I don't know, there's probably some major things that would change too once the game becomes the subject of teaching, right? If it's the assigned book versus the book that you're reading for yourself, right? If it's the book you're about to have a test on, uh, instead of the thing you're doing to stop having to think about that test you have tomorrow, you know? Those again are also quite different. And so that's something I think about a lot in terms of teaching these games one day, which I totally intend to do, and have done a little bit of just online, you know, but not in person. And and it's, I think it calls into question whether like assigning things is necessarily the best way to go about teaching them all the time, right? Maybe if people are doing things for fun already, and then all that you assign is the process of thinking about those things, you know, then you don't have to assign them to play the game because they're going to do that anyway. Instead, you just have them, you know, look at a rubric for discussion, for example, right? And say, okay, now we're going to talk about that thing you did anyway. And here's how I'm going to give you feedback about this discussion. Now let's go. Let's make this really good. Okay. Right. And so maybe there's some ways to avail ourselves of those different approaches to experiencing the game, those different things the game can be for people, that do allow us to kind of have our cake and eat it too. That's the dream anyway. And you know, some people might really want to design games of their own, and so they're after specific things. And again, I wouldn't be the best teacher for those things. I don't know about the code. I don't know about the original language, right? The Japanese text is kind of outside of my ken, and so I can, you know, I can only do so much in those areas. But for people who want to, you know, think about, you know, what does this game reflect about the time when it came out, and what does it reflect about the kinds of experiences that people have when they are that age, you know, of coming of age kind of story, and for understanding relationships, the difference between childhood and adulthood, like all those things. I think that is where discussions of the game are really valuable. Um, and yeah, they should be informed by having actually played it for sure. But I don't know that that has to be a kind of inviolate, you know, sort of experience by any stretch. So.
Well, and thus we find ourselves having put away childish things just in order to become childlike again. Can we see with new eyes that which we have once seen? Can we pour new wine into an old wineskin? You know, I wonder to what extent we are sort of looking to have our cake and eat it too, or looking for something like an allegory for the Holy Grail, right? Like part of the notion behind the Holy Grail is that you drink it and you become young again. And to some extent, this is the ultimate mythological topos. You see this in Gilgamesh with the snake. You see this in various mythological systems that have resurrections. You see this in Platonism, Hinduism, Buddhism. You see this in Christianity too, with the notion of the resurrection. The idea, and even, you know, Arthuriana, the idea of Merlin and aging backwards. The Benjamin Button, even in contemporary movies and film. But, you know, are we chasing, not like a heroin addict, are we chasing the dragon? Are we chasing a figment of our imagination, attempting to have a new experience with something that, when we did have a new experience of it, imprinted on us in a permanent way? Such a permanent way that we're reconsidering its impact on our lives and on culture 2 decades after it was put out. Or are we simply scholars now and are investigating, you know, the mechanism or the tool that had that effect and why it had that effect? And I think that's an interesting tension, because something that I think both of us want to be open to. This is true, I think, of the text that we teach, as well as the video games that we're playing, or the video game that we're playing now. I think you're playing a couple of video games. Is can it still touch us at the deepest level? And even at our more advanced stage, even though now we're in very different places in life, and even though the tool may have been first developed in order to create, say a real Bildungsroman in the player, as the character that one is controlling in the game experiences it himself, right? Mm-hmm. Part of what Squall does is realizes that he has friends and has family, and it's going to come out of his shell, and he's going to have to save the world in order to do that. But as he does that, ostensibly we grow, and like a shonen jump anime develop from, like, say, young boys into young men, or young people into more mature people. And so at this stage in our life where we're facing middle age, and rather than the transition from, say, adolescence to teen, or teenage years to college years, and what sort of person are we going to become, now do these games, or does this game in particular, have the capacity to show us what we are, or perhaps maybe this is what we're looking for. And I know we're looking for several things. We're not just looking for one thing and we're not just using a microscope. We have a telescope, we have glasses, we have all sorts of lenses to use to look at this game. But are we trying to find ourselves? And by seeing what we were, and now having a new lens to see what we are, and to see how much we've grown or degenerated, or gone off the path that we expected to go during the course of our lives, by returning to this thing that was once sort of a hook for our projections. And can it now be a hook for our projections again? Yeah, it's sort of like what Harold Bloom says Leo Strauss says when reading historical texts. Are you just reading it to read a historical text and to see what these older, prejudiced, foolish folks thought, or are you reading this text to gain some insight from it, knowing that it's also going to be missing some modern trappings? Is it the case that some 12th century epic poem written in French can in fact still, speak to your soul and change you in some meaningful way? Or do you just read it in order to see how it changed people in the 12th, 13th, 14th century? With this game, are we looking at it to see how it changed us when we were 14, 15, or affected our lives as we were growing up? Or does it still have the capacity to change? Will we be changed, further transformed by this game again? Will it have that transformative capacity? I do think that's the bigger, more important question than, what is interesting about this in a scholastic way. There are people that are covering, right? You've got Gallagher writing essays and books on this. You've got the theological podcaster with the sprites.
Oh yeah.
I need to look more into him. And then, of course, you've got Resonant Arc and Final Fantasy Union doing fantastic scholarly work on these and many others on these video games. But I do remember that was something we were eager to explore in Final Fantasy VII, and I continue to be eager to explore that in Final Fantasy VIII, while also being a bit of a skeptic and a pessimist about the capacity for this tool to do for me now what it did for me then. Though it might be able to do, hypothetically, for me now something similar to then, but in a different way, given my new stage and place in life. In fact, I'm not an 8th grader about to go into high school. I'm a scholar about to go onto the next step of being a scholar, and maybe take my family to the next level too by having some kids. I have dogs, right, and they're a lot of work. You have kids, and so you're way ahead of me in that sort of thing. But or when it comes to that, but that is my question about this game / text. Can it still transform us? And are we just doing something scholarly here by looking at this historical thing and its impact on culture, with also its impact on us, or will we come out of this study different at the end of it, and transformed, and have done something meaningful for our own development, our own selves, our own amusement, besides just for sort of the archives, adding to the archives, as it were.
Right. No, I mean, at the very least, it is, I think, an interesting research project, something scholarly. But there's inevitably some aspect of like nostalgic, self introspection, whatever you want to call it, right? That goes along with it. And it's just fun. I mean, it's a good way to kind of unwind. As boring as it is sometimes to sit there and draw, it's also kind of satisfying. It's like, all right, just got
Yeah,
5
no,
hours. Cool.
you have to wind yourself up to unwind sometimes. It's something
Yeah.
I realize, I have to go for this, I have to go for these physically taxing runs in order to feel relaxed.
Mhm.
Otherwise, I feel all wound up. Or I look on Instagram, I see all these fit influencers saying, "Yeah, I got my workout in today, and I feel great." And I just glumly stare daggers at these images and videos of these fit, happy-looking people while I'm feeling unfit and still, what is it? Sleepy, droopy-eyed from sleep 2 hours
Yeah.
after waking, with 6 shots of espresso in me. But if I go through the physical, or if I physically exhaust myself through this exhausting run, or if I go through the onerous task of drawing, perhaps I'll still feel some real sense of accomplishment and engagement, not only with my past self, but with the game anew. And so, again, I'm a pessimist and a skeptic about this, but I am hoping we can pour new wine into an old wineskin.
I think so. So
Yeah, I'm not discounting it, but I'm just saying I wonder. And I question. Well, for next time, perhaps we will do some further discovering of what's going on in the world of Squall Leonhardt and Final Fantasy VIII to get further details on Renoa. You, of course, have to finish this first mission, and I'm looking forward to hearing what your seed. One personal note is that I called the seeds CDs.
CDs.
I
Right.
think the entire time I played the game as a kid, because of how seed is spelled with the capital S, lowercase e, and then capital D again. It looks like CD. Also, there were CDs at that time, compact discs. So there were connections to be made that would lead me towards that era. Now we don't even use DVDs or Blu-rays really. Does anybody use a physical copy of movies anymore? I think mostly, I guess some video games do, but you can still download them digitally, which is what I've done with Final Fantasy VIII and what I do with any other game that I want nowadays on my Nintendo Switch or PS4. Those are the two next gen consoles I have. Though again, I don't play them very much. But in any case, it's looking like we're going to get away from our garden for the first time and go out into the world. And well, I'm looking forward to doing that with you, Wes, and putting out the third episode as soon as we can.
Cool. Yeah. In about a week.
In about a week.
Put a few more hours on there and make some progress. Yeah.
Yeah. Make sure to draw just a few more spells.
At last,
All right.
I'll be ready.
Well, thank you again. And I'm looking forward to continuing to move forward into the world of Final Fantasy VIII with you through this side quest VIII.
Appreciate it. See you.